shared in the department.
Fine, yeah. If I can have the link as well.
Yeah, I can make it public. We don't share very widely, but it's up to you. It's okay.
Happy with that?
I'll share it.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah.
Okay, let's start. Apparently the room is booked afterwards, so if you do want to chat to Wayne afterwards, we can go. There's a little coffee place here. We can go back to Marcus if you want to chat to Wayne. So yeah, really excited to have Wayne here. Wayne's currently an associate professor in plant ecology at Durham University. And his work focuses on the establishment, spread, and management of invasive plant species, but he does a lot more than that. He's also got extensive projects all around the world and in the UK, looking at plant invasions and how they impact mammals as well. So not totally plant biased like me. So Wayne did his got his PhD in 2009 at Aberdeen University in collaboration with ecology and hydrology. And then he went on to work as a senior postdoc at the University of Constance in Germany. And Wayne is one of the creators and leaders of a global list of naturalized alien flora. This has been a really important point in our data collection and in our science of invasion ecology. It's contributed to many manuscripts and other ideas coming from that, including the theories. So I'm going to shut up because I'll talk about it too much. But anyway, I would really like to say, I know you told me not to, but in January, Wayne will be joining the University of Liverpool as a professor in the Department of Evolution, Ecology and Behaviour. Congratulations and thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you for that really nice introduction, Zara. I'm now dying of embarrassment. That was really lovely. Thank you, and it's great to be back in Stirling again to give this talk. So my talk is going to be focusing on biological invasions, and in particular what climate change will mean for biological invasions now and in the future. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on this fantastic subantarctic island of South Georgia that you can see in the photo here. And you'll see there are two names here, not just mine, but also Pierre Tichy. Pierre Tichy is a postdoc who's working on this particular project, and he did the field work and has been doing the analyses of the data for this project that I'm leading, so that's why his name is there. Okay, so just to give you a bit of a summary though, in case you're not familiar with the idea of biological invasions, we think of invasions as being like a process with various stages. So the very first stage is that a species might be introduced from its native range, say South America, to a new location like South Georgia in the South Atlantic. And it may get there intentionally or unintentionally through human movements. Some of those species that get introduced to a new part of the world, they may be able to survive in that climate and then reproduce. And then a small fraction of those may then be able to establish their own self-sustaining populations in that location. Then a few of those established introduced species may be able to spread much further than the original sites of introduction into the wider environment, into the wider region, at which point we say they are spreading or they are invasive. And really, since my PhD, my research and the research of my lab has been focused on which species are going to be introduced, which ones become established, and which ones are spreading, and what are the reasons for those successes at each stage of the invasion process. Okay. With that in mind, this was the makeup of my lab in Durham until fairly recently. You may recognise one of the people. So until recently, Katie Iverson, she completed her PhD this year. She was looking at herbivory of introduced and invasive plants in Europe and Norway and how climate change is going to affect their invasion risk in the future. She's now a postdoc at the University of Birmingham. In the top right, we've got Dr. Peter Stewart, who's in the audience. Working as a postdoc here now. He was looking at the impacts of prickly pear puntia on mammal habitat use and behaviour. And still in Durham with me at the moment is Alison Copeland, who's another PhD student. She's looking at the ecology of Bermuda's introduced invasive flora. She's actually from Bermuda. And then finally, we've got Pierre Tichy, the postdoc that I just mentioned. He's been working on this project, trying to understand how native and introduced plant and invertebrate species are going to respond to climate change on the island of South Georgia. And it's that work that I'm going to focus on. I should say in the middle, this picture of the world with a magnifying glass and lots of plants, that's just signifying, as Zara said, the macroecological side of things, trying to understand species patterns in terms of invasive plants that are moved around the world on a global scale. The GLONAF database has been the focus of a lot of my work until fairly recently. But I'm also really interested in trying to understand how invasive plants interact with soil microbes, such as mycorrhizal fungi. And that's something that Zara and I are starting to collaborate on in the UK. Okay, so that's an introduction to me, to the lab, on the general topic. Let's move on to biological invasions, what they are and why they matter. So, as I'm sure you're probably aware, species get moved around the world by humans because of largely trade and transport, okay? So we've got on the left-hand side a snapshot from the website marinetraffic.com showing locations of all the world's boats and ships at one point in time and the world's oceans. And then on the right, we've got another fantastic website that I could sit and watch for hours. This image and these little planes moving around the world. We can see that there's a lot of planes up there moving goods and people around the globe. Okay, and it's these trade and transport links that are so voluminous and so rapid now compared to what they were in the past, which mean that we're breaking down biogeographic barriers that have been there for a very, very long time. And as a result, the rate of species accumulation in terms of introduced and established species globally is continuing to increase. So you can see here on this famous figure from a paper by Hanno Siebens and co-authors back in 2017 that we get to the 1850s. So industrial revolution starts in the UK. There's a lot of colonial expansion. We start to see first records of species in new parts of the world. And then we get this uptick from about 1950 as trade and transport really increase after the Second World War. And that accumulation of introduced and establishing species worldwide is continuing to go up and up. Why does that matter? Well, as I said, some of those species are able to spread, become perhaps dominant in the communities and ecosystems where they establish, and that has an impact on biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So we know from the BES study in 2019, the report looking at the different major global change drivers, that biological invasions are one of those 5 major drivers of global change. And those are shown in dark green on these bars here. So you can see that in the terrestrial environment, the biological invasions are almost as important as pollution as a global change driver. And in freshwater systems, they're almost as important as climate change. Okay. And of course, these global change drivers are going to be interacting with one another to affect biodiversity and ecosystem function. It's not just an ecological impact that they also have economic impacts for us, for societies and economies. So this figure here, this bar chart, simply shows the cumulative economic costs of different taxonomic groups of invasive species around the world over about a 3-decade period, okay? And it's valued in 2017 US dollars. You can see that scale is in millions. If we just look at all invertebrates, for example, we've got nearly $0.6 trillion worth of economic costs globally occurring from invasive invertebrates, such as mosquitoes, for example. For plants, it's around about 200 billion. That's probably an underestimate figure. And many of these costs are going to be underestimates in reality. So we've got ecological costs and economic costs. So they do matter. They also matter in terms of islands, because as was shown in a study back in 2017, if we look at the bright red dots here on this map and the bright red island regions, these are the top 2.5% of regions globally that have the highest numbers of establishing introduced species across different taxonomic groups. So we've got places like Hawaii, we've also got New Zealand here, and islands here in the Indian Ocean, just to the east of Madagascar. They all have very high numbers of established introduced species. And still, many species, they might not necessarily be on these islands, but they still pose an imminent invasion risk to remote and vulnerable islands. And islands are vulnerable because they often have vacant niches, they have a lot of people visiting the island, a lot of goods being imported, so the chances of arrival of invasive species is actually quite high, and there are many endemic species that therefore may be threatened with reductions in their populations or even extinction in some cases. And just to highlight 4 from different taxonomic groups here, these are different species that pose a high invasion risk to UK overseas territories, which are mostly remote islands. And so there's this global awareness that's really built up over the decades as to the threat that invasive species pose to biodiversity and ecosystem function, so much so that in the global biodiversity framework from Kunming, Montreal, there is now a specific action target to deal with invasive species to try and reduce their rate of introduction and establishment and spread at a global scale. So it's on everybody's radar. And it's also on the radar when we look at the Antarctic and the surrounding islands in the Southern Ocean and in the Southern Atlantic Ocean in particular, for this study that I'm going to talk about. But you can see on this figure here that comes from a recently published database on introduced and invasive species in the Antarctic region, that we've got quite a few species already present on a number of the islands and an increasing number on the continent of Antarctica itself. So even the Antarctic region is at threat from invasive species. And we also know that we've got rapid warming that's occurring in polar and subpolar regions. So this is just last year's data on the departure of temperatures for land and oceans compared to a baseline from 91 to 2020. And you can see down here, this little cell here, okay, down in the Southern Atlantic Ocean, that's actually where South Georgia is. And you can see it's fairly red, which means that temperatures there even recently are starting to go up compared to the last decade baseline. So a big question for these polar and subpolar regions and islands is, how will new introductions to them and invasions that are already underway respond to climate change? What's going to happen in these places with these newly introduced and past introduced species? Are they going to spread? Are they going to die out? Are they going to become more of a problem? And then another question is, for those that may arrive there but are no good at actually establishing in the current climate, are they going to be able to do so in the future climate? And to try and address those 2 questions, this project, which is funded by Darwin Plus, which is really part of DEFRA, is focused on South Georgia in the it's a sub-Antarctic island, as I've just pointed out to you. And as you can see on this figure, here's South Georgia. It's many, many, many kilometers away from the nearest land masses, okay? So it's very remote, difficult to get to. And it has multiple glaciers and fjords, as you can see in that figure there. And if you look at the northern side of the island, all of these peninsulas here, you can see these areas highlighted in green. This is where the vegetation largely is, okay? So the vegetation is confined mainly to those peninsulas. And you can see we've got these fjords with these glaciers that terminate in the sea. These are tidewater glaciers. It's a globally important bird and marine conservation area, so really important for populations of penguins and also a number of pinniped species and also whales in the surrounding waters. And there are a number of endemic species present too. So there is the South Georgia pipit, shown there on the left. And then on the right, we've got the tussock beetle, which features on the stamp for the island, despite the fact that nobody permanently lives there. It has a stamp. I think it's something that stamp collectors like to get a hand on. and that species is also endemic. It lives in this species of what's called tussock grass, usually on the island. It's important for its biodiversity, okay, globally. Even though it looks pristine, it looks a bit like the Alps in the middle of the southern Atlantic Ocean, it has suffered from human impacts over the past century or so. So you can see in this photo here, you've got this ruined whaling station, and it used to be a global centre for whaling back at the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. A lot of Norwegian whalers lived there and whaled there, and the whaling was mainly to supply oil. Okay, so these tanks that you can see rusting towards the top left of the picture, these would have stored oil, okay, from the whale, from boiling down the whale blubber, essentially. That thankfully doesn't happen anymore, but with the whaling stations and with people settling there, there were several introductions. So rats and mice got there unintentionally, escaping from ships. Reindeer were introduced intentionally by the whalers as a source of food. And a number of plants from the northern hemisphere were introduced in hay for the reindeer. That's where we think they came from. And there are also predatory caribid beetles coming from elsewhere in the southern hemisphere. So a real mix of species have been introduced there. And you might have heard this in the news a few years back. There was a big eradication campaign on South Georgia to completely remove the mammals, in particular the rats and the mice, through some pretty spectacular spreading of poison from helicopters, which didn't affect the native wildlife, but did actually eradicate the rodents. And I think to this day, it's still a rat and mouse-free island, which is great for the local seabird life. And the reindeers have also been removed as well. So the mammals are gone, but we've still got left behind 8 introduced plants, okay, that are so well established that there's just no way you're going to remove them entirely, even if you wanted to. And 2 of them are shown here in the figure. You can see these bright green patches. This is Poa pratensis. So this is a northern hemisphere European plant native to the UK. And those brown kind of clonal patches here, this is Agrostis capillaris, again, a native to Europe and parts of Asia. So those species, among others, are still present and well established and may continue to spread. And the invertebrates, the caribid beetles, are still present, which are predatory. So that may have an impact on the native invertebrates. And if we want to even try to manage these species in future, we do need to monitor them, get a good idea of where they are and where they're going to spread to. Go on, next slide. There we go. But it's not just introduced species that are a type of human impacts that South Georgia has been exposed to. It's also, as you've seen in the figure I showed you, the temperature increases globally. It's on the front line when it comes to warming, increasing temperatures. So this is one of the glaciers that terminates in the sea on South Georgia. You can see the mountains in the background. In 2022, this picture was taken. That's where the glacial front is. This is where the glacial front was in 2017. So that's just a 5-year difference. The glaciers here are melting at an unbelievably fast rate and receding and leaving behind this exposed, so far uncolonized land. And this picture here, based on satellite images over the years of South Georgia, gives you some idea of how much glacial retreat there is in other parts of the island. So in red, you've got where the glacial fronts were in the 1970s, and then in yellow, the 1990s, in green, the 2010s. And you can see that in a number of these north-facing glaciers, we've got extensive receding of those glaciers back towards the mountains, away from the sea. Okay. And the Neumeier Glacier, which is just here, is particularly pronounced. So that glacier at times is retreating at a rate of 1 meter per day. So this is where it was in the year 2000. This is where the glacial front was in 2016. So pretty astonishing rates of receding. So a big question, the first big question that we wanted to address in this project was, how is climate change going to affect South Georgia invasions in respect of these areas of deglaciation. So what is going to be colonizing and ending up dominating those areas of land that are left behind once the glacier has melted? In particular, will invasive plants colonize first and native plants prevail as communities succeed over time in those areas? So just to show you two of the non-native plants that we're interested in that are present, there's a species of chickweed, Cerastium fontanum, and annual meadow grass, Calla annua. Okay, and you'll see more of these in the next slides. And then number two, on top of that, what's going to happen in terms of competitive ability of the introduced versus native plants? Are we going to see in a warming climate greater competition from those non-natives? So here's one species shown here in green, Deschampsia cespitosa, overtopping the native brown Festuca contracta. Are we going to see more cases of like this where the non-natives are outcompeting the natives when the climate warms? So to look at the first question, what's happening in these areas of deglaciation, we've got two sets of glaciers that we've focused on. So the first one are the tidewater glaciers. So these are the ones that terminate in the sea. So Pierre surveyed last year 3 different sites, the Lyell, the Harker and the Nordenskjöld glaciers. And you might think, well, 3 glaciers isn't very many to sample, but if anybody knows South Georgia, it's incredibly difficult to get to. It's incredibly difficult to survey there. The environmental conditions are hard. It's difficult to get to these different locations around these peninsulas, and access is actually restricted by the British Antarctic Survey and the government of South Georgia. So there are limits on where we can go for this survey work. But we've got these 3 sea terminating glaciers that Pierre surveyed. And he also surveyed some areas of upland ice loss, so about 400, 500 metres above sea level, shown there where those purple stars are. And for the sites that terminate in the sea, the tidewater glaciers, Pierre essentially set up chronosequences. So as an example, he set up transects on this particular glacier around the 2014 mark and 2003 mark. Behind that rock bluff there would be where the 1990s, 1993 terminus was for that glacier. And he had transect surveys at those different time points of deglaciation, and he recorded the presence of different plant species in aerial quadrats, so presence, absence, and then he got a measure of percent cover using pin quadrats along transects. But then also he wanted to know what's going on with the invertebrates. So he had pitfall traps at different points along those transects, and also conducted hand searches and soil sampling on those transects. For the sites that are deglaciating in upland areas, either we had completely extinct glaciers, so they're not there anymore, or they were very much reduced, as shown in this figure here. And there's no equivalent satellite mapping available in order to tell us where these glaciers terminated back in the past. So the best we could do was to have recent deglaciation points adjacent to the existing ice or to a known location of ice based on paper maps. And then 200 meters, what would have been downslope where the flow of the glacier was going. So those would have been the older deglaciation points that had been deglaciated for longer. So I'll just give you some results from that first survey that Pierre did of those different sites. So this is for the tidewater glaciers. And as you'd expect, with succession over the years, when we get up to about 30 years, we're increasing the number of vascular plant species that you find at a particular site of deglaciation. And then shown in the bottom, we've got the number of species present in the older versus the recent deglaciation sites in the upland areas. And again, you can see with time, you accumulate more species, which is what you'd expect. So nothing too exciting. However, what we did find was that within those surveys, the introduced and invasive plants are widespread. Okay, so what we've got here is we've just got the frequency of occurrence in percentage terms of different species, and in light blue we've got the natives, and in pink, we've got the introduced species. So the second most frequently occurring species in those tidewater glacier areas was Cerastium fontanum, introduced. And then if we look at the inland glaciers, we had annual meadowgrass, Pala annua, was the second most commonly found species. So it's pretty astonishing, really, in these areas that are, you know, very remote, quite far away from the original locations of introduction to these species, we are finding introduced and invasive plants. And they're common, more common or more frequently found than many of the natives. However, what I should say is that they do seem to be declining over time, both in terms of presence and abundance at these tidewater glacier sites. Okay, so here on the top figure, the negative values are showing where a species is declining over time. These effect sizes, this is the effect of time since deglaciation. The positive values indicate species that are increasing in likelihood of presence with time since deglaciation. And what you can see is our two pink species, the introduced ones, okay, they're either at 0 for Cerastium, so that's present regardless of time since deglaciation, but Pala annua, the annual meadowgrass, excuse me, actually declines over time, okay, as succession kicks in, and presumably they get outcompeted by many of the natives shown in blue, such as Achena magellanica and Festuca contracta. And we see similar patterns occurring when we actually look at plant cover. This time, though, for plant cover, we see a reduction in Cerastium fontanum rather than Pala annua, and the natives are increasing in cover over time. You can see that more clearly when you actually look at the response curves of these species' presence in relation to time since deglaciation. So you can see the steep rise for Achena and Festuca, the two natives there, and they get to about 50% presence around about 20 years, both of them. Whereas Pala annua, we have to judge this with a little bit of caution because of the very wide credible intervals, that is declining over time. Okay. If we look at the uplands, sites of ice loss, what we see is an interesting picture whereby we've got this native species, Colobanthus, a little cushion plant, is increasing in its likelihood of presence when we have greater times since deglaciation, and then also Cerastium fontanum, one of the non-natives. So we've got a native and a non-native increasing in likelihood of presence, okay, in those sites that were deglaciated further back in time. Yes, you can see that more clearly when you actually look at the means for those two species. Okay, so it does look like those introduced plants, particularly Cerastium fontanum and Pala annua, are really ahead of the game in terms of colonizing early successional sites where we've had deglaciation more recently, okay, before the natives get there. And this is happening at coastal level, and it's happening in the upland areas about 400 or 500 meters as well, okay. For the second question, this is work that's still ongoing because I've only just got hold of the climate chambers in Durham, and I'm going to be getting new climate chambers in Liverpool to do this. We want to do some competition experiments to see, okay, if we get an average, if we work out what an average increase in temperature is going to be for this part of the world by around about 2080 to 2100, and if we were to grow our invasive plants shown in purple here in competition with our native plants, who's going to win and who's going to lose? Okay, so this is an experiment that is going to be set up very soon in order to answer that question. So we've got a set of 6 native and 8 invasive introduced plants to use in this experiment. And in order to get a more realistic idea of what the diurnal temperature variation is like for this experiment, to try and simulate things as naturally as possible, we've set out TOM-SD data loggers in South Georgia so that we know what the temperature is like 10 centimeters above the ground, shown in red in this figure here. And you can see that we've got temperatures that go below 6 at night, and then they go up to more than 12 during the day. And that will give us a much more accurate idea of what the temperatures are like now compared to, say, what a weather station would give you. And it's those temperatures that will then be the basis of model predictions for what the future climate might be in that experiment. so that we can see who's going to win and who's going to lose among the plants. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gear and talk about invertebrates. I did mention them briefly already. So this is one of the invasive carabid beetles, Merizodus soledadinus. It's always hard to say that one, that's present on the island. And Pierre, as I said, set out those pitfall traps and did hand searches, turning over the stones and collecting soil samples to work out what the invertebrate communities were like in these areas of deglaciation as well. And so, as before, this is a frequency of occurrence plot for our native and our introduced invertebrates. And you can see that this invasive carabid beetle here, Merizodus, was fourth. Okay, probably joint fourth with two of the natives, but certainly more frequent than the native endemic herbivore that we've already been introduced to. So it looks like the Merizodus is getting more widespread in these deglaciating areas than one of the native herbivore beetles. Okay. But when we look at what happens in terms of the actual effect of time since deglaciation, we can see that there's not a huge difference in the effect of time since deglaciation for the invasive predator versus what we think is one of the native prey items. Okay. And you can see that's the case when you look at the actual responses to time since deglaciation for these two species side by side. So it looks like they're arriving at similar times, similar rates, or at least we can't tease apart any of the differences with the data that we have. So this can mean one of several things, but given that this species is probably predating on this one, what it means is that the native endemic beetle is never going to escape predation from this novel predator within this particular system. But at least it means that the endemic beetle can arrive at other sites and isn't restricted to where it currently is in vegetated areas. So the population should still increase. So Pierre, number 3, this is the third thing that we want to do in this project, is to really focus in on those invasive carabid beetles a bit more now, and to try to understand what the distribution is now compared to in the past. So some work was done by Pete Convey, who works at the British Antarctic Survey, trying to map using opportunistic surveys where these species of carabid beetles are actually present on these peninsulas in South Georgia. And this map shows here the state of play, as far as we know, in 2006 to 2009, okay? Now, I should say that these are flightless predatory ground beetles, so they can only scuttle around the ground in order to disperse, they can't fly. And as with the rodents in the past, there's concern that as the glaciers recede and these peninsulas get reconnected with one another, it will spread quite rapidly, okay, on the land that is connecting those previously separated peninsulas. And they're also species that can very easily hitchhike in people's luggage, on their clothing, in their rucksacks, okay? And so there is a risk that scientists and tourists in South Georgia may inadvertently spread these species on the island when they go for a cruise around it. But on the ground, at least in these particular peninsulas, we're trying to assess what the current distribution is, whether the species of beetle are spreading upslope or laterally or both, and how does that relate to the composition and abundance of native, presumably prey species of invertebrate that occur in these areas, some of which are pictured in those photos. So what Pierre did at the beginning of this year, as well as finishing up the deglaciation survey, he also did a more rigorous, thorough survey in multiple sites looking for these carabid beetles as well as the native species. So he focused on hand searches and stone turning searches to try and find these beetles. And to look at the effect of altitude, he had 2 kilometre long transects going from 0 to 400 metres above sea level. He had pitfall traps every 100 metres and turned over 10 stones every 100 metres, and had additional sampling points in lower elevations to capture all of the vegetation types present on the island. And just to give you an idea of the areas that he surveyed so far, those are shown with those blue dots there. And so far, based on that and opportunistic observations that he and others have made on the islands, we now know that these species of caribou beetles certainly have spread, at least on the peninsulas where they're already present. So you can see a lot more beetles shown on that bottom right map. That's how I'm going to summarise it for now. We haven't found any down in St Andrews Bay here, showing where that pink cross is. So Pierre managed to get there on one of his outings and didn't see any. And what Pierre is actually trying to do now is to use occupancy modelling in order to estimate the probability of occupancy at different sites, accounting for detection probability whilst turning over these multiple stones and setting up these multiple pitfall traps. And that work is still ongoing. So I'm going to move on to the final thing that we're trying to do with this project, and that is predict future invasions, okay, taking into account climate change. Right, so with an increasing temperature on South Georgia, the climate is going to change, and it may mean that the climate's more suitable for species likely to arrive on the island to be able to survive, reproduce, and establish their own populations, okay. And a really nice example of a species that's recently made it, may have established its own self-sustaining population on the island, is this 11-spot ladybird beetle. It's quite a cute little beetle, native to temperate Europe and Asia. And Pierre, just by chance, found a colony of these beetles in one of these deglaciation sites that he was visiting for a completely different purpose. Okay, so it's really lucky that he and the field team found it. But it is the very first record on the island of this particular species, and we think it's most likely that it's arrived from established populations here on the Falklands. And many species like this are going to arrive accidentally as transport stowaways, maybe as contaminants if we're thinking about seeds on people's shoes or in their luggage, sometimes even food that's brought to the island for the scientists and visitors to eat that may also contain unintentional introductions. What we really want to do in this final kind of phase of the project is to try and get some handle of how likely it is different species are going to arrive, where they're going to arrive from, okay? So these histograms here are just showing for the last tourist season, the number of tourist ships arriving on the island or to the island with visitors coming from different ports originally. So those based in the Falklands, they've been to Antarctica, they've been to mainland Argentina and other locations. But it looks like the Falklands, it's pretty obvious that's where those ships are coming from. But we also know the nationalities of the tourists, okay? And that's important because people may be carrying things with them to the previous port that they were at, okay? So that represents an introduction risk. You can see the USA followed by Germany. Those are the most frequently visiting tourists to the island. So we can use that information about where ships are coming from and who's on those ships, where they're coming from, in combination with databases about species that are already introduced to the region or elsewhere across the globe, for example, using the Global Naturalized Alien Flora. And we can start to filter out and work out which species are most likely to arrive through these tourism transport pathways. Okay, so this is the result of a classic study done for tourists at Antarctica back in 2014, which really nicely showed that when it comes to footwear, a large proportion of tourists had seeds attached to their boots. Okay, so it's really important to clean your boots before you get to places like South Georgia. But if we can identify the species that are likely to come in through these different items of clothing or other pathways, then we can narrow down and say which ones are most likely to arrive from our source regions. Okay. And then we want to know whether they're going to be able to establish in the future climate, so say by 2070. And we can do this by looking at where species are currently occurring across the globe using databases like GBIF, and we can work out what the climate is in those areas of occurrence right now. And we could build species distribution models in order to understand where they might be in the future. So we can project those species distribution models to target regions using predicted temperatures and other climate variables for 2070, and then that will give us some estimate of probability of occurrence in that future climate scenario and where exactly in our region those species might be able to establish. And you might be thinking, hold on a minute, this is Scandinavia and Norway shown here. The reason why I've got those examples there is because this is something that a former PhD student of mine, Katie Iverson, has actually done for Norway, and we're hoping to apply the same techniques to South Georgia and other islands surrounding Antarctica. And then finally, we need to think about which of those species that can arrive and establish, which ones might have an impact. This is going to be the really tricky part because impacts in the future are potentially going to be very different to what they are like now or in the past. But the best thing we've got to go on is probably the Global Register of Introduced and Invasive Species, which catalogues those species that are known to be invasive and have an impact on scale. And then hopefully what we can do then is have some kind of future climate horizon scale which identifies a set of species that the South Georgia government can keep an eye on and kind of check in terms of biosecurity to see if they are going to arrive and act quickly to stop them from establishing in advance of the warming climate. That's the idea anyway. Okay, to sum up, have I got time? Good? Yeah. So to sum up, I've shown that introduced plants and invertebrates on South Georgia, they are rapidly colonising these sites of deglaciation. But we've also seen that at least one of the introduced plants, maybe both of the two that I showed you that I highlighted, they seem to be declining with time, okay? But they still remain a component of the communities that are establishing in these deglaciation sites. So that raises an interesting question, thinking about invasion ecology in a neutral sense, that we may end up with fairly novel communities of native and introduced plant species on this island in the future. And it'd be interesting to see how they succeed further with time. It might be that the early colonization by those introduced plants changes the successional trajectory slightly. It might be that they're speeding up succession and natives can colonize more quickly. That might actually be a positive. We've seen that the invasive predatory beetles definitely becoming more widespread, and further modelling work will hopefully establish that for definite. And we still need to understand what the effects on the native invertebrate communities might be. Are they declining in these areas where the predators are arriving? One would assume so. And then finally, just to finish up, if we really want to reduce introductions and invasion risk in places like South Georgia, we need to have biosecurity that is climate smart. We need to be looking a bit further than just say 10 years down the line and try to work out which species may pose a risk further in the future as the climate changes. Okay, so I couldn't talk about South Georgia without showing you a picture of some king penguins. So there we go, even though the study's nothing to do with them. Just want to say thank you to the funders, collaborators on the project, to the South Georgia government for support, and you for listening. And I also want to finish with just a shameless advertisement. As Zara said, I'm moving to the University of Liverpool right at the start of January to set up a new lab there. We've currently got a PhD project which involves working with Zara, looking at impacts of invasive plants on soil microbial communities. So if you're interested or think there's somebody who might be, please pass the message on to them. And I'll also soon be advertising for a 3-year postdoc to work with me at Liverpool to look at enhanced mutualisms in plant invasion. So keep your eyes peeled for that advert if you're interested in that. Thank you. I don't know if there are questions on Teams. Does somebody want to?
Yeah, I'll monitor.
Oh, you've got it, great.
So, yeah, of course. So we'll give preference to people in the room, and that's what we get. And if there's time, we can take some from Teams as well. So anyone have any questions in the room?
Yeah, the time since glaciation process, surely is that also correlate with factors like distance from sea sources and elevation and temperature? So how can you really say which of those factors is responsible?
For the tidewater glaciers, that's all at sea level. There's not really any going up in altitude for that. I think you're right for the seed sources, but I guess for the seed sources, I would need to check exactly where the original sites of introduction are. I think there's some uncertainty about where they were. It's probably near the huts around the whaling stations. But I think from what I can, from off the top of my head, the sites to be surveyed are sufficiently far away for that not to lead to this just early successional colonization of the Poa annua and the Carastium fontanum. And both species found really far away, 400 meters up. You know, that's 2-3 kilometers away from these sites. So, you know, I think you're right. It's difficult to tease apart, but I think that it's unlikely that that's causing any confounding. Yeah. Yeah, I think Kirsty, you had a question. Sorry.
I just wondered what kind of biosecurity measures they have on South Georgia, if any at all. I was thinking back to when I went to Australia at one point and they found out I'd been to New Zealand, took away my boots of wool. So I'm imagining they don't do that to tourists on cruise lines.
I had the same when I was a lot younger and a lot more naive. I went from South Africa to Australia, had feathers of a beautiful bird, a roller, really lovely blue feathers. Didn't quite think of the risk of moving them. Australia said, yeah, it's fine. They dipped them in disinfectant, the ends of them. Got to New Zealand, they said, absolutely no. They need to be destroyed, and fair play. I completely agree with that. South Georgia, I'd say, has very, very rigorous biosecurity compared to a lot of other island regions. But still, like the 11 spot ladybirds, some things still get in. They have stiffer dogs to check for rodents on a regular basis. Ships aren't allowed to actually moor directly next to the coast. They have to moor further out and people are brought in. So it's very rigorous, but still things get missed. Yeah.
Nigel?
So, do you think sort of the next place you work will potentially expose any kind of tropical escapes next year? So, are you finding more invasive habits in patches or terminal invasive virus, or to the upstream effects of some of the invasive habits reduce densities of seed native invertebrates, or the upstream effects on small rodent through that
Yeah, I think the first question that you asked is certainly one that we'd like to look at, if we can get enough areas that haven't been invaded by the plants and compare them in terms of what's going on with the native and non-native invertebrates. Absolutely, be interesting to look at that. I mean, the rodents aren't there now, so there shouldn't be any concern that there's more food for the rodents. The rodents would go for the birds first anyway, or at least their eggs. But yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And I think it just needs some very careful experimental design or observational study design to get your comparator sites. Yeah, good point.
So I just wanted to know about the kind of the endemic species that we have there. Are the look at the figures there, that's 10 kind of plants and commercial score species that you look at. Is that the case? Not all endemic or widespread
the native plants, none of the native plants are endemic. They're all native to the South American continent and elsewhere in the Southern Ocean islands. For the invertebrates, I think there's still some uncertainty because they're relatively understudied in terms of what's endemic and what's not. So there's a flightless midge that is meant to be endemic, at least to the region, if not to the island, but it seems to be absent. And the thought is that it may have been driven to extinction on that island because of the invasive carabid beetles. Now, I don't think we want to say it's definitely extinct on South Georgia yet, but we haven't seen it in our surveys that Pierre has done over the past 2 years. And we just don't know enough yet about the population status of things like the endemic tussock beetle that I mentioned to know what's going on with that. So it does need further monitoring over time. But yeah, I'd need to look into more detail to find out what percentage of the invertebrate fauna is endemic. So that's about.
So I think time-wise, we'll leave it there. I think I mentioned waiting around for a little bit. Still, we're going to catch your kid.
Yeah.
But if anyone has any questions, like ask them. So yeah, just to thank Zara for inviting me and for giving a good talk. Thank you very much.